And it was a real frustration to the father because his father was a professional and he was really wanting him to get on with his life. And I had a theory about why the son was like this. And part of my theory for this is that the father was way too dominant in the home. And so the son, there was no power for the son at all. And I think it was kind of his way of unconsciously getting back at the father, who was very successful. It's almost like saying, I'll show you how unsuccessful I can be. And it was a constant source of irritation. These individuals have poor peer relations, tend not to do well in school, despite the fact that they may be very bright. They're intellectually capable of doing well. They just don't have the drive behind it. They may lack interests in hobbies, or if they do have hobbies, any hobby that doesn't involve people. Computer games, I would imagine, would be one of the more favored types of activities. Tend not to have a sense of humor, although in some cases you may find these are creative individuals. And as I was saying earlier, drive seems to be a big issue for schizoid personalities. In terms of the ICD-10, you can see that the criteria for schizoid personality is pretty close to that of the DSM. The individuals are detached, cold, aloof, little interest in sexual relationships, but as I was saying, perhaps not in terms of interpersonal contact, but I find it hard to believe that particularly men that have no sexual interest. So I would imagine they're fulfilling it in another way. This is kind of different with the ICD criteria compared to the DSM. The idea that they have a fondness for fantasy and introspection, that's not really part of the criteria of the DSM. According to these criteria, they're indifferent to other people, they don't have friends, and tend to be insensitive to social norms. As a result, they're more likely to make these social blunders. Throughout this course, we've been talking about how personality disorders, styles and personality disorders kind of blend into one another. Milan talks about the retiring personality. So this would be an introverted style or a schizoid style, which would be adaptive. Oldham and Morris in their personality portrait book talk about the solitary type of individual. And an argument could be made that some of the greatest thinkers that have ever existed on this planet tended to be quite solitary. A number of media examples, perhaps some which are not necessarily full-blown disorders. Ever watch that movie The Net with Sandra Bullock? Yeah, she's got some schizoid traits. I don't know if I would say you could actually diagnose Sandra Bullock with any kind of disorder. Batman is an example of a solitary type of character. Mad Max, ever check out that with Mel Gibson? So he's got some schizoid features. You probably haven't seen too many Clint Eastwood movies, but some of his westerns, he always plays the lone gunman. So he travels from town to town, has no friends, winds up doing his business and winds up leaving. And the one we're going to take a look at now is the Zero Effect. And specifically, we're going to look at Bill Pullman's character, who plays this individual called Daryl Zero. And Daryl Zero is this private detective that is supposed to be exceptional at his job. Pay attention that he's also got some schizotypal features as well. So I think it'd be fair to say he's both schizoid and schizotypal at the same time. So how would you say that he is somewhat schizotypal? What were some of the features that you noticed from this clip in contrast to schizoid? Odd beliefs, so what would be an example of that? Yes. What about the locks in the apartment? You check that up on the top floor with a steel door with an elaborate code with 5 locks that then has to be decoded once you enter the building. So that type of stuff is not part of schizoid. That's more of schizotypal. But yet we do see the schizoid features with him as well. Why would an individual like this wind up going for treatment? Consistent with a lot of problems, probably a major clinical syndrome, such as depression, would be the prompt. Or it could be that there's some sort of major life change, that the parents of this individual are saying, look you've got to get on with your life, you need some help, or your spouse says, you need help. Consistent with what we saw with Jerry in the interview, in contrast to Daryl Zero, who's somewhat interesting, I thought Jerry was quite a boring individual to interview. And you would see that if a person like this came in for an interview, they don't seem to be uncomfortable. What would you see with the schizotypal types, though, in an interview situation? If the schizoids aren't really uncomfortable, how would the schizotypals come across? And anxious. That's right. So diagnostically, that may mean something to you. Individuals that, when you interview these types, you just can't seem to connect with them. And so these personalities radiate little emotional warmth. So if a schizoid individual is depressed, he can talk about the depressive symptoms, but they seem to be intellectualized in some way. The interviewer doesn't really feel that the individual is depressed in any way. As was mentioned earlier, schizoid types of individuals, when you're interviewing them, they'll say yes, no, give short responses. You'll find that the interviewer does a lot of work trying to keep the conversation going because they don't. They don't know how to sustain it. What's really wild about this is if you ask a histrionic person a question, any little trigger will allow them to go on and on about whatever the topic happens to be. With schizoids, it's the exact opposite type of situation. So how would you interview somebody like this if you were in that situation? How would you kind of change this up, given that they only give you yes and no questions or answers to questions? Yeah, even with the open-ended questions, they're not going to give you a whole lot of detail. They'll shut it down pretty quick. Well, it could be something along the lines of asking them a complex question. I don't know. And that's all they say in terms of the response. Maybe something along that line. They're very difficult individuals to interview in general. Robinson suggests that you ask a whole slew of questions with these types of clients and have them prepared. You'll find that there's themes of the person being withdrawn and reclusive. They may be very bright, and schizoid personality is not correlated with intelligence, but nonetheless they'll have a job which is far below whatever their potential could be. These are individuals that are observers of life, kind of like what we saw with Daryl Zero, but not a participant of life. Not a whole lot of drive. Some have even said that schizoid personalities are kind of robotic, just going through the motions. And you find that these individuals tend to have constricted emotions. So can you think of some jobs that they would be very poor at as a result of this? Yeah, so typically how do servers come across? They got that energetic, bubbly type of attitude. Hey, how was your day today? And, right? So very engaging in that way. Schizoids are the exact opposite. Won't last long on the job if that, in fact, is the case. It's been argued in the past that there's a link to schizophrenia with schizoid personality. That is debatable. The closer association would be with schizotypal personality. So why does somebody like this develop it? It could be that maybe there's something with the wiring of the individual, that they really lack the capacity to display emotions the way that others do. What I believe why this develops is that they come from homes where there isn't a lot of emotional attachment to significant caregivers. The parents will provide for the individual's physical needs. The person probably doesn't need anything in their life, but there's this emotional distance which takes place. So it could, and others have suggested that the exact opposite, as opposed to parents being cold and distant, that they're too involved with the child, and the child winds up withdrawing as a reaction to this.